I heard some news earlier this week that was so unbelievable, I chose to not report on it because it just didn't seem true. The quick summary is that Apple made changes that break how web applications work on phones in the EU. When I heard it, the assumption I had was that this was a bug in the most recent beta version of iOS when they were testing new things, getting ready for the new browser support. Because if you haven't heard this already, definitely check out my last 2 videos covering the Apple drama, because the EU is stepping in and making Apple make some real changes here. The change we're here to talk about today is not one I expected. It's a consequence of Apple making changes they're supposed to and deciding to change functionality in the process. First, we need to talk a bit about browsers. At this point in time, you might feel like you have multiple browsers on your iPhone, but you actually only have one. The engine that powers the browser, that actually loads the pages, runs the JavaScript, and shows you the page itself, that engine is only able to be the Safari engine, the WebKit engine. And when you're putting your own browsers into iPhones, as such, you can't actually make a new browser in an iPhone. You can only make a bunch of things that wrap that engine. This sucks because you can't actually run Chrome on your iPhone. You can only use what's effectively a Chrome theme and skin wrapping WebKit, which is the same core as Safari. Firefox, same deal. All of those companies have made their engine work on an iPhone, but Apple will not let them ship it. That's not the specific problem here, because the EU actually ruled now that Apple has to allow other browser engines on the App Store. So finally, we're going to see real competition, at least in the EU. But there's an important tangent here. To understand it, we need to talk about a thing called progressive web apps. You probably think of an app as a thing you install from the App Store, but you also use websites. And a lot of those apps have websites. What's the difference? Well, the difference is when you're in the browser, you're in this sandboxed environment that has limited access to things. It doesn't really have control over things on your phone itself. It just shows you a page that the phone renders in Safari. If you want to do something like, let's say, send notification to somebody or have their camera work or use their GPS for precise tracking, those types of things require an app because they're using your phone's hardware and functionality at a phone level entirely differently. This is where progressive web apps come in, because not everybody wants to build an app and go through Apple's process, but maybe they need some small things like notifications or a home screen icon to go to it quickly. And as such, companies like Starbucks and even Twitter have embraced the idea of a web app that you go to the website, you embed on your home screen, and when you click it, Apple puts it in its own unique shell that's closer to an app, but still isn't quite an application. I'll be clear though, progressive web apps aren't super popular. Funny enough, a lot of why is because Apple has limited their functionality so significantly. They only recently allowed them to get notifications, which is insane. The only way you could previously send a notification to an iPhone user as a developer was to get approval from Apple to put something on the App Store that they installed through that. There was no other way to send notifications other than an email. What? I was actually surprised how much better Apple was getting about supporting these things, which would open up the entire ecosystem significantly. And then I heard the news that in that beta update to iOS in the EU, you can no longer use progressive web apps. I didn't believe it. My assumption was that as they were adding support for these other browser engines, a few things broke. So they changed the behavior when you add a website to your home screen such that it would just open it in the browser instead of opening it in this native container. I also assumed there would be plenty of options to get around that and have your progressive web apps still open in the Safari hybrid thing, but have everything else go to the browser engines. If anything, this seemed like a bug. And according to this article that I've been staring at this whole time from TechCrunch, with the official confirmations from Apple, this is intended behavior. They intended to fully break progressive web apps in the European Union. Let's hear about why. Well, it turns out it's not a bug that broke iPhone web apps, also known as progressive web apps, PWAs. You'll hear this abbreviation a lot in the European Union. Following developer complaints and press reports about how PWAs were no longer functional in the EU after installing the most recent iOS betas, Apple has updated its website to explain why. No surprise, the tech giant is blaming the new EU regulation, the Digital Markets Act, for the change, saying the complexities involving with the DMA's requirements to allow different browser engines is the root cause. I can hear him a little bit here. If PWAs have to both run in external browser engines and still have support for all these native APIs, there's a lot of annoying things there. Everything from security constraints to making sure all the browser engines have support for all the things people expect, to deciding if they want to have different PWAs open different engines, to deciding if they should support them in the first place. There's a lot of things here to be decided about. And the DMA's ruling is pretty clear that any website or link a user can go to needs to work in any browser engine by any company. So if Apple wants to support these things in Safari, they have to enable them for these other browsers. Their solution is the classic Apple way: kill it for everyone. To catch you up, security researcher Tommy Misk and Open Web Advocacy first noticed that PWAs had been demoted limited to website shortcuts with the release of the second beta of iOS 17.4. Initially, it was unclear if this was a beta bug, stranger things have happened, or if it was intended to undermine the functionality of PWAs in the EU, a market where Apple is now being forced to allow alternative app stores, third-party payments, and alternative browser engines, amongst other things. In the beta, PWAs, which typically allow web apps to function and feel more like native iOS apps, were no longer working. Developers noticed that these web apps would open like a bookmark saved to your home screen instead. This is the important bit. They didn't quite touch on how different PWAs are here. There are so many pieces of functionality and things you can do in a PWA that you cannot do with a web app that you normally would have to do a native iOS app for. Here's a quick list that Google will tell you about all the things PWAs can do that you can't do otherwise. Offline access is a really big one. You can go to the website, because you're not downloading new data necessarily, but you still navigate it and use the things that have been downloaded on your device without having to be online. Huge. You also can have push notifications, like I mentioned before, which is dope because you don't have to go to a site to check if you got some information, nor do you have to install an app. It also hides the URL bar, so it feels more native. This you can do with a website too. Quick load times, that's a thing. And access device hardware. Again, this is the core part. You can use native hardware and native OS software features that were not available in the browser. I love that they keep saying push notifications, but that is the biggest one. Better camera behaviors, better photo access, those types of things. You get native access to a lot more things in the OS when you're a progressive web app. I would normally include Bluetooth, but Bluetooth also works in the browser. Yes, you can actually connect a Bluetooth controller to your browser and control things, which is really fun, annoying, long separate tangent for another time. Back to this. As Mac Rumors pointed out at the time, that meant that no dedicated windowing, notifications, or long-term local storage. Actually, that's another important piece. Long-term local storage. The ability to store something on the device for a very long time. So if you have like a note-taking app, you can store the notes locally in the phone's browser cache. That isn't really a browser cache, it's your local storage, and that's just there forever. Once you throw that in the browser, you're at the whims of Safari. iOS 16.4 also allowed progressive web apps to badge their icons with notifications, as native apps could. But beta users of iOS 17.4 reported that when they opened a web app while running the iOS beta, the system would ask if they wanted to open the app in Safari or cancel. The message indicates that the web app will open in your default browser from now on. Afterwards, users said that they experienced issues with data loss, as a Safari website shortcut doesn't offer local storage. Notifications also no longer worked. That sucks. Imagine like you're working on something in one of these PWAs, you install the newest iOS update, and it's just gone because Apple turned off that support in that API entirely. I could not imagine Apple just gutting something like this. And I do still genuinely hope this isn't the case and that there's some misunderstanding and miscommunication here between Apple, TechCrunch, and this release. But I know Apple employees watch some of my stuff. I don't know if iOS people and iOS decision makers do. This is not good. This is going to take away a lot of the good favor you've been winning with web and web developers recently. I even just recently did a video covering Pickle, your new configuration open source language that I thought was really cool. This sucks. I'm not even a big fan of progressive web apps. I think they're honestly a little overrated, but just killing existing things that follow web standards because you decided you don't like the way you're expected to comply with these new regulations and just deleting this stuff for a bunch of people in the EU. That's insane. This is anti-user, Apple, and this is not the company that I've been defending as long as I have. So the reporting says there was reason to be cautious about whether or not the change was intentional. Multiple staff at TechCrunch repeatedly asked Apple for comment but received no reply. We had wanted to know if the company would confirm if this was a beta bug or an intentional change, and if the latter, what Apple's reasoning was for it. I mentioned this earlier. This was so absurd, I just assumed it was a bug, and that's why I didn't talk about it before. I had people asking all week and all stream on Wednesday, and I'm doing it now instead when I'm supposed to be packing for a trip. After the next beta release emerged, The Verge ran a report indicating that Apple appears to be breaking progressive web apps in the EU, after also not likely getting a formal response from the tech giant. Now, Apple has responded in its way. Today, it updated its website detailing its DMA-related changes in the EU to address the matter. In a new update, the company explains how it's had to make so many changes to iOS to comply with the EU guidelines that continued support for progressive web apps was simply off the table. You know what? I'll be a little critical of the EU. It's only fair. I'm honestly kind of upset at how much the EU's regulations aren't about the rights of developers so much as the expectations of companies. If I was the one writing these rules and regulations, my focus wouldn't be so much on Apple has to support all of these things in all of these ways. It would be these industry categories exist. They are different industry categories, and you cannot use your success in one to brute force leverage in other ones. That's monopolistic. When you win one corner of the industry and you use that to win a different industry, that sucks. And when Apple uses their massive adoption of their phones in their operating system to prevent other browser engines from having a chance in the market, those browser engine manufacturers and developers should be able to sue Apple for that. And the failure I see is more in the ability for developers who are affected by Apple's bullshit to fight for it. It's insane to me that whole market categories like game streaming can just be deemed by Apple as not something they want to support, and they'll just gimp an entire industry that they're not even competing in because they just don't like it. And the EU's rules go too far the other way. They're no longer focused on those developers and their specific needs. They're focused on forcing Apple to comply. And as much as I like the goals in those regulations, and as much as I appreciate the level of detail and the focus on specific things like browser engines, I think declaring browser engines a thing is more important than declaring Apple is bad. And since Apple now has to comply not with the court's ruling after being proven as having a negative impact on a company like, in this case, Google or Mozilla, instead it's being forced to rebuild their operating system to comply with these new rules that the EU put out. It feels like we're getting further and further away from the intent here, which was to allow the developers to ship the software Apple had decided they didn't want them to, and move towards the government deciding how the operating system works. I'm not saying these changes are bad. I'm just saying we need to think more about the actual impact. And rather than just getting hyped that Apple's being beat up, we should think through the actual damages that we're trying to prevent. In this case, the companies and things they're trying to build that aren't able to because of Apple's weird rules and restrictions, or things like the 30% cut that no one can compete with because Apple has decided they're not allowed to. Those types of things should result in lawsuits like the Epic suit, and those things should be won by the people who pursue them. And the legislation's focus should be enabling those people to pursue those means. That is not what's happening with the EU legislation. The DMA is not focused on the individuals who are impacted. They're focused on the idea of a free market and fair market. It's to be determined how well that works, but it does seem like the expectations on Apple here are weird. The rule around how links have to open whatever your default browser is makes things like progressive web apps significantly harder to implement, and the complexity around them very real. I am very annoyed Apple is going to break old software instead of doing the thing they normally do when they don't like these changes, which is work with the EU until they come to terms that are good. They just don't care enough about PWAs to put themselves out in that way. The fact that they have to put that level of work in and they have to deal with all of this chaos shows that maybe things were a little too far with the DMA. I'm excited for everybody in the comments to tell me how stupid I'm being for saying that. I'm just trying to present both sides here. I specifically want to push the idea that maybe helping companies that are victims of these things pursue action might be better than demanding a specific idea of what a market looks like. Because markets shift, the DMA will be out of date before it's ever actually enacted on. And maybe we should start from where the harm is, not from where we want things to be. Just a thought. Back to this article. Traditionally, the iOS system provided support for home screen web apps by building directly on WebKit, which is Safari's browser engine, as well as its security architecture. This allowed for web apps to align with the same security and privacy models as found in other native apps. I'll go a step further here. Not only did the original iPhone refuse to support apps, like there was no app store for the first 9 months of iPhone because they just didn't care. It actually pushed HTML5 really hard, largely because they didn't want to do an app store because it would be less secure than having Safari as a nice little sandbox, and because they refused to support Flash, which was the accepted way to do interactive applications in the web at the time. A huge part of why JavaScript and HTML and CSS, like the modern tools, got so popular was Apple pushing them really hard with the iPhone launch, just to leave it all behind as soon as they shipped the App Store. So it is funny that they're citing security being comparable to that as other native apps. This is hilarious because previously they didn't do native apps because of the same things they're citing here. Now they're saying the browser is as safe as native apps. Previously they were saying native apps aren't safe enough to compete with the browser. I digress. But with the DMA, Apple's being forced to allow alternative browser engines. It argues that without isolation and enforcement of the rules applied to WebKit-based web apps, malicious apps could be installed that could do things like read data from other web apps or gain access to a user's camera, microphone, or location without a user's consent. These are real concerns because right now, every website is sandboxed to its own frame with its own permission set, all done through Safari's weird layer that is built deeply into iOS. If they were to require every other browser implement every single one of those things properly, and any of them screwed up, that's bad. But if they don't give access to those things, then that's worse. They're going to get fleeced for that. As a result, we're in chaos here, and they've decided to just axe it entirely. Addressing the complex security and privacy concerns associated with web apps using alternative browser engines would require building an entirely new integration architecture that does not currently exist in iOS and was not practical to undertake given the other demands of the DMA and the very low adoption of home screen web apps. They're calling them home screen web apps. This is their term for PWAs. It's true that they're not very common, but maybe, just maybe, it's a certain company that's caused them to not be so popular. And so, to comply with the DMA's requirements, we had to remove the home screen web apps feature in the European Union. The company informs EU users that they will be able to access websites from their home screen through bookmarks as a result of the change, confirming developers' concerns that progressive web apps were effectively being disabled in the EU. We expect this change to affect a small number of users. Still, we regret any impact this change that was made as part of the work to comply with the DMA may have on developers of home screen web apps and our users, Apple says. Critics have argued that Apple's desire to hold onto its power in the iOS app ecosystem was so strong that it would break web apps functionality for users of its devices. Apple defenders, meanwhile, will probably argue that the company's explanation is reasonable and aligns with Apple's desires to keep iOS safe for its users. The truth, as it often does, likely lies more in the middle. Well, yeah, both of these statements are wrong, so let's dig into that one real quick before I end this. I don't think people understand how much Apple tries to avoid the optics losses they take with things like this. They know how bad this stuff looks. That's why they gave USB-C out as a standard. That's why they have so much open source stuff lately. That's why Apple Music is on Android. That's why AirPods work on every Bluetooth device ever and are one of the best Bluetooth headphones on Android phones even. Apple does not like when these things happen. They look very bad for them. In order for them to do this, they have to factor the actual brand damage it does against the cost of not doing it. The cost of doing this properly and continuing to support PWAs is a lot higher than most people seem willing to admit here. Apple's excuse is real here. It would be very hard to implement this in a way that follows the DMA's rules and allows every browser to have a good progressive web app experience that doesn't break users' existing expectations or existing applications. That's non-trivial, and to pretend it is annoying and dumb. How non-trivial is it is a much bigger and harder question, and should the EU have even legislated this in this way, another bigger and harder question. The simple point I'm trying to make, which I do think is in the middle here, is that Apple's breaking things not just for developers now, but also for users, and their justification is realistic in that it would be expensive to not do this. This is going to be such a shit show. I'm not excited for this comment section. Anyways, that's all I have to say here. Hope you guys enjoyed this news. I certainly didn't. Hopefully, with enough outrage, Apple will decide to invest in doing this properly, but until then, this might be the end of progressive web apps. Apple was just starting to embrace them a little more seriously, and then, just months later, made them entirely non-viable for a huge portion of potential customers. Thanks, Apple. Appreciate the content. Good seeing you as always. Check out my other Apple videos if you haven't, and peace, nerds.